Wrapping up a special series on South Asia, I will be getting the Indian side of the story on the bloody clashes between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. As Donald Trump celebrates Bastille Day in France, how shall we view the relationship between him and his French host? And with China now an important global financial player, what risks is China facing to keep its financial markets vital and stable at the same time? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Liu Xin. Welcome to the final installment of our week-long focus on the South Asian subcontinent. Remember, during our first episode on Monday, we looked at the most recent clashes between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. I had the Pakistani ambassador as my guest, and I promised to bring you the Indian perspective late in the week. Well, today we'll do that. Since Monday, the situation has moved on following the shelling between Pakistan and India, which killed 7 civilians on both sides. The Indian government is reported to have been briefing leaders of opposition parties on issues including the Kashmir situation. This has been an extraordinary move, as most decisions by the Modi government are taken without keeping the opposition in the loop. Why is the government doing it this time? To get more insight, I'm pleased to be joined from New Delhi by Professor Tridivesh Singh Maini, a foreign policy analyst at the OP Jindal Global University. Professor Singh, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, it's been 5 days since the deadly shelling and tensions are still high. What's behind this latest skirmish?
I think this is, if you look at it, both sides, the Pakistani side says that, they've come up with a figure of this year itself 500, 600 shellings. Similarly, if you look at the Indian side, we also have our own figures. But the larger issue is that this is part in India. We look at it as a sudden, Pakistan since 2014 has been more aggressive on raising the Kashmir issue at international platforms, and at the same time, aggression across the LOC is one thing, but we are having, since last year there have been a number of terror attacks. You had a terror attack first in Uri last year. We had a terror attack in Amarnath where pilgrims were killed 3-4 days ago. You had yesterday again 2 of our military personnel were killed. So the fact is that Pakistan can come up with its figures. India will come up with its own figures. It will be an endless thing. But at the end of the day, what is happening is that for domestic.
Now, the ambassador of Pakistan to China, as you said, Masood Khalid, told me on Monday that there have been 554 ceasefire violations from the Indian side in 2017 alone, and India's provocations along the border and armament upgrade is not conducive at all in maintaining peace and stability in the region. How do you respond to the ambassador's comments?
I think the first thing is, obviously there needs to be, in fact the ceasefire, the initial ceasefire was initiated by India in 2003 by the then Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And obviously India is very much interested in the ceasefire. There has been talk about the DGMOs reaching out to each other. But the fact is that, it is cherry picking. You can't just cherry pick and say that in the last 4 days India has been doing it. The fact is neither of us is there on the ground. We don't know it. But all I can tell you is that in the last, this is a larger issue, and Pakistan generally has been more aggressive on the Kashmir issue in the last 3 years, and a number of terror attacks has gone up. And obviously, if they start off, the policy has changed to a degree that there is full retaliation from the Indian side, but that doesn't mean that we don't want restoration of some basic.
Why would the Pakistani side want to be more aggressive all of a sudden?
I think what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years, you see the domestic, if you look at the domestic, a lot is said about the domestic politics of India, but if you look at the domestic politics of Pakistan, the civilian government finds itself embroiled in a number of problems, and this is a good, to become more belligerent on Kashmir is a good way, of distracting people from that. And the army generally has become more assertive You know, in Pakistan, it was expected that with the civilian government coming in 2013, things would change. But the civilian government lost control within a year, year and a half. And I think this is part of a larger, as I said, policy of, you know, being more aggressive on Kashmir. Now, this also includes a
Okay, at the same time, I'm sorry, yes. I keep interrupting you, but at the same time, India is upgrading its military forces with purchases from the US, Russia and Israel. For instance, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US last month, the Trump administration approved a $2 billion sale of surveillance drones to India. I mean, you were talking about Pakistan being more aggressive, but India's stepping up its weaponry. Is that also contributing to the situation, to the balance of power in the region?
Well, let's look at it separately. You know, you asked me first the question about ceasefire violations. That is separate. But the issue is that, you know, if India finds that, you know, Pakistan is being used, or attempts are being made to use Pakistan to contain it, and attempts are being made by other external powers to encircle India within South Asia, it needs to look at alternatives. Definitely, and I don't think, if just as China has good relations with many of India's neighbors in South Asia, if India develops strong defense ties with the US and Israel, it doesn't mean that it's targeted either at Pakistan or at China, but yes, you have to be ready. If India does certain things in its own self-defense, I don't think that anybody can object to it. I don't think any of these alliances are targeted at China. And let's also understand that the India-China relationship is a manifold relationship. It is an extremely important one. And I think you know, the leaderships, I hope they understand that. There have been very positive signals from the meetings on the sidelines last week at the G20. So I think these two, we are in an era where you can have multipolar relationships, and you need to dehyphenate, you know, defense relationships and economic relationships.
Yes, but at the same time, you were also talking about certain powers trying to encircle India in South Asia. I think it is very clear who you're talking about. It is true that in the government there is the will to maintain good relationship. However, some media in India seem to hold very negative views about China, even suggesting that China is behind the skirmish between Pakistan and India. Is this view widespread?
No, I think if you go through, I don't think Chinese media ends at one newspaper and Indian media ends at one newspaper. I think if you go through, there have been some very nuanced pieces by people who have been part of the foreign service. Some eminent diplomats have written pieces recently. Naturally, between two countries, between India and China, there are bound to be differences. But at the same time, and obviously we understand the China-Pakistan nexus also, and we cannot deny that. There's no denying that. But it doesn't mean that, you know, there are no shades of grey. And secondly, if you look at you know, the Chinese media as well, you know, I was reading today that there have been, you know, there is talk about the 1962 war and trying to evoke images of the past. Now, it's up to us. I think it's up to the the leadership and, you know, the sort of intellectuals, the intelligentsia on both sides to make a choice whether they want to think of 1962 or whether they want to think of 2022. I think, you know, the recent skirmishes between India and China as well were a bit of a setback to the relationship. But I think, as I said earlier, there are too many stakes involved, and I think things will get back on track. Now, as far as the region is concerned,
we do hope so. And we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, time is up. But many thanks to Professor Tridivesh Singh Maini, foreign policy analyst at the OP Jindal Global University, joining us from India. And with that, we are wrapping up our week-long series on the South Asian subcontinent. After 5 days of discussions, it can be said that the mistrust between India and China is running deep. China's economic achievements over the past decades, China's friendship with Pakistan, the Tibet issue, now nationalism. These are all factors that have fed into such mistrust. The two sides really need to understand each other better and look into the shades of grey, as just pointed out Dr. Singh, and not just on government level, but also in the media and by ordinary people. That would take time. However, mistrust is no excuse for wrongdoing. Undisputed national borders need to be respected while greater understanding is being built. While China does not want to see conflict break out on the Dockland section of the borders between China and India, there is no possibility for China to back down, as territorial integrity is a core interest issue for China. You've been watching The Point. I'm Liu Xin. We'll take a break and we'll be back right after this. To another topic, and French President Emmanuel Macron and US President Donald Trump held a joint press conference on Thursday after the American leader arrived to take part in Bastille Day celebrations. After bilateral talks that focused on free trade, climate change and fighting terrorism, US President Donald Trump said the friendship between our two nations and ourselves, meaning him and Emmanuel Macron, is unbreakable. Yet sharp differences between these two sides remain, especially on free trade and the Paris Climate Accord. Now, Trump's presence in Paris also brought back memories of his harsh comments about the city during recent terrorist attacks, saying Paris is no longer Paris, not to mention his support for Marine Le Pen, the far-right presidential candidate who Macron defeated in May. So is the friendship between Macron and Trump really unbreakable, or is it just wishful thinking on behalf of Donald Trump? And how closely can the two countries cooperate in the future? Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Professor Christopher Chambers at Georgetown University. Professor Chambers, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, Trump and Macron aren't known for seeing each other eye to eye. Why is Donald Trump such a high-profile guest during the Bastille Day celebrations?
Well, the President of the United States is always a high-profile guest, no matter what differences might be evident bilaterally. But these are two countries that, by all accounts in history, might not even exist were not for each other. The United States certainly would not have existed were not for France, and France was in trouble in the First World War, and the United States lent a hand and helped defeat Germany. So, I mean, there is a history there, and it you know, that is long-standing, and then there's a trade and intellectual and cultural ties between the two countries that are much more important than nationalism and other sorts of movements in the United States or France or problems over trade. So it's an important relationship that has to be nurtured despite differences, and they might even be personal differences. It has to be maintained.
Yeah, I'm told that we're joined now by Professor Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School in Paris. Dr. Yates, thank you very much for joining us. How do you gauge the personal chemistry between US President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron?
Well, my take is that it's all image and no substance. I would call this diplomacy light, very low calorie. For example, I don't expect anything concrete to come out of it. And we've seen a series of these meetings, and I think it's because Donald Trump's prime motivation in traveling to France is to escape scandalous revelations at home. The real question has been, what are Macron's motivations?
Yeah, what do you think is Macron's motivation, Dr. Yates, Professor Yates?
Well, I've had to think very hard about this, and I think there's many answers, but two strike me as particularly good. One, this is a confidence-building exercise. Macron sees an opportunity. Trump is tremendously unpopular. His meeting with Putin went bad. His relations with the president of China have gone poorly since the North Korean incident. His relations with Mexico are bad. His relations with Germany are bad. His relations with England are bad. He's running out of possible good relations. So it could have been a confidence-building exercise, but I can't help thinking, how much more young and handsome Macron looks when he's sitting next to Donald Trump. And this might be like inviting an ugly girl on a date to the bar to try to attract other players.
Professor Chambers, what's your take?
Well, I mean, I agree on many levels. I think the one concrete level that we have to, we can't really put aside is that Macron, on one level, is a free market economic conservative. I mean, he does believe in that kind of a system of finance and free trade, and I think that, you know, there is some room there for improvement, and I think he sees that. He wants French business and the EU to still be strong, and he wants that all front and center in President Trump's mind. I mean, aside from that, I agree with Professor Yates. I mean, a lot of it is for show, but it is a confidence builder for a younger president who wants to show that he is a world leader. He is up there with Angela Merkel. He is up there with, you know, whoever is running Britain at the time. It's not really sure who's running England at the time, but he wants to show that he can take leadership of the EU and he can be basically Europe's front man, if you will. And I think this is a good way to do it, and to do it with the perfect foil, which is Donald Trump. Well,
talking about free trade, is it likely that Macron might be running against a dead-end street? I mean, Donald Trump is famous for saying, you know, let's not talk about free trade, let's talk about fair trade, and the difference is really, you know, quite big, Professor Yates.
Right. The trade agenda is not particularly propitious at the moment. But on the other hand, most of the trade agreements that are in place are not being actively dismantled. That in the numerous agenda items on Donald Trump's list, breaking or dismantling trade relations with the European Union has fallen to the bottom. So he has a lot of other things to do. On the other hand, as I say, I wouldn't expect anything substantive to come out of this, and that would include trade.
Well, another very interesting point for Chinese people is that both leaders mentioned China in the joint press conference. For instance, Trump called Chinese President Xi Jinping a friend and a great leader he respects. He said he's a very talented man. I think he's a very good man. He loves China. I can tell you he loves China. He wants to do what's right for China. We've asked him for assistance with respect to North Korea, probably who could do a little bit more, but we'll find out. And Macron also said he and President Xi have a number of joint commitments, including on climate change. He's very committed to that. He told me he wanted to do more in the field, and I can only be happy about. Why is China so central in the joint press conference between the US and France? Professor Chambers.
Okay,
Professor Yates.
Professor Yates, you go ahead.
I have to admit, yeah, I believe that when you look at the leaders of the 7 most powerful nations in the world, and you start to eliminate leaders because of weaknesses or problems, what you're left with is maybe the only adult in the room who's an honest man is the president of China. And China has a strong economy. China is rising in power. And elsewhere, it's really, it's a basket case situation in my country, in the United States. Europe is floundering at 1–2% growth. Much of the BRICS countries are also suffering because of low commodity prices and corruption scandals. We're seeing the former president of Brazil actually being sentenced to prison, and the current president facing corruption charges. South Africa's President Jacob Zuma is also facing a revanche of his own leaders. So when you look around the world, there's kind of only one president who seems to have his act together, and that would be the president of China.
Wow.
I'm not surprised both of them are flattering. Yeah. What else could they do?
Very briefly, 15 seconds if you can, Professor Chambers, what's your take?
Oh, I think that I agree with Professor Yates. I mean, you have this force in the East and now globally, that is China, and neither the EU or the United States can ignore that. And China must be brought into even bilateral talks. China is there kind of looming in the background and has to be addressed and has to be brought into these even bilateral talks. And even a way of Macron showing that he is a leader in the EU. If the EU wants to deal with China on trade, on climate change, alternative energy, security, Macron wants to build himself up as a leader within the EU, he has to talk about China, and he has to remind President Trump that China is important. And, you know, I think that the Professor Yates nailed it as to why.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. That's a good compliment, but also a lot of responsibility. Many thanks to Professor Christopher Chambers at the Georgetown University and Professor Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School in Paris. And you're watching The Point. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back. Financial vitality will lead to economic vitality. Financial stability is leading to economic stability. Chinese President Xi Jinping has stressed the importance of financial security on different occasions. And after years of financial reform and development, China has become an important global financial player. But many still worry about China's financial health. Is China at risk of a financial crisis? Could China's debt problem trigger a systematic bankruptcy? Is the government doing too much or not enough in terms of regulations? These and other questions are widely debated both inside China and abroad as the world is closely watching the financial performance of the world's second largest economy. To have an in-depth look at China's financial industry, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Fred Hu, an economist with the prestigious Tsinghua University. Professor Hu, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what are the biggest financial risks China is facing at this moment?
Well, you know, there's rising debt-to-GDP ratio in the economy, increasing non-performing loans in the Chinese banking system to a large degree due to the struggling industries from steel to coal with the excess capacity. Fairly rapidly expanding but very opaque shadow banking sector. And also the implication of certainly hard housing market, what would happen, spill over into the financial system. So these are, you know, somewhat interconnected but very complicated financial challenges facing the economy right now.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of problems and very severe. Now, Moody's Investors Service downgraded China's credit rating in this May for the first time in nearly 30 years. Now, it also expects that the financial strength of the Chinese economy would erode in coming years as growth slows and debt increases. Do you think the downgrading was reasonable, and how serious is China's debt problem?
Well, I can see where Moody come from in terms of downgrade. Up to this controversial, nevertheless, I do think it will be prudent for Chinese policymakers and financial institutions to take the Moody analysis seriously. It doesn't mean China is on the brink of a financial meltdown, which I don't think that's the case. However, we cannot afford to be complacent. I think Moody's downgrade should serve as a warning message so that we can all be vigilant about some of the risks that are facing our economy.
Now, the Chinese government has been seeking to reduce financial system risk by tightening the screws on leverage. Have the deleveraging efforts paid off yet?
Well, deleveraging is necessary, but let's face it, it's also incredibly difficult and painful. So, last few years, I've been watching this very, very closely. Yeah, we have made some reasonable progress, but on the whole, it's still not enough. I think far more to be done. So this is a really delicate balance. If we deleverage too drastically, our economy could be plunged into a much deeper slowdown than desirable. But if we delay kicking the can down the road, we may end up into the Japan situation. So, the problems continue to compound, to fester, then the eventual cleanup would be even more costly with a very dire consequence for their real economic growth.
It could be best. It could be argued that it would be best for money to go into the real economy. Do you think the Chinese government has been doing enough to direct, money to go into the real economy and to squeeze out the economic bubbles? Where is the money mainly going now?
Well, 2 years ago, most of the money went to stock market. So there was a speculative frenzy causing a bubble in the equity market, which absolutely crashed. Nowadays, I think there's more the housing. There's more speculative capital inflow into the housing sector, pushing housing prices sky high. To really, for financial system to serve the real economy, small medium-sized enterprises, innovative startups, or consumer, I think we need financial reform. Including some of the promising fintech companies like Anti-Financial. They are primarily trying to provide credit to really small businesses and households.
Will that affect China's international competitiveness in terms of financial market? These kind of reforms?
Oh, definitely. If we want to build a world-class, efficient financial system, we need to be more open and to have more competition. We are the second largest economy, but our financial system is still very closed, incompatible to our global status. I don't believe closing our financial system will make our safer or stronger. On the contrary, we need to open up more global integration so we can leverage global best practices and knowledge experiences, and the competition will make us strong.
I think that has a point. Well, we'll keep close watch on the situation, possibly some more news coming out next week on China's future direction in this sector. Many thanks, Dr. Fred Hu, who is a prominent economist from Tsinghua University. So wrapping up with my quick last point. Another week has gone by. I hope you've enjoyed watching our show. Leave a message and tell me what you think and what topics that interest you the most. That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. You've got The Point.